Okay, calm down.
This actually started because I had emailed you in frustration about your advice about how to respond to a certain argument. But it's related exactly to what you're talking about, because I hear what you're saying, and it's so clear to me that what Israel's doing is unnecessary. I mean, that's an understatement, and it's a war crime. But I keep hearing people say something like the following. This is an email I got. Katie, there's a difference between willful intentional slaughter born of a stated constitution and century-old goal and deaths during war. Israel is fighting for its right to exist. It's as nuts for LGBTQ folks to be defending Palestinians where they would be killed as it is for liberal Jews to defend them currently when their stated goal is to push us into the sea, Zionist or not. They hate Jews. They affiliated with Hitler, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem helped shape him being Hitler. Again, difference between intentional slaughter of civilians and casualties of war. And Palestinians elected Hamas and allowed them to divert huge amounts of support supplies to their major stated intention, clean Palestine of Jews from the river to the sea.
Number one, Israel began the current quote unquote operation by declaring two things or three things. Fact number one, the president of Israel, Mr. Herzog, he announced that there was no distinction between Hamas and the population of Gaza. He said that they elected Hamas and then they have to bear responsibility. So, the fundamental principle of what's called international humanitarian law, IHL, it's sometimes abbreviated, or you can just call it the laws of war. The fundamental principle of the laws of war is called the principle of distinction. Every one of your listeners knows that principle. It's illegal under international law to target civilians or civilian sites, and the only legitimate targets are combatants and military sites. The principle of distinction. On October 8th, the day after what occurred in Israel, President Herzog declared, we don't believe that distinction exists.
This rhetoric about civilians.
Yes, every person in Gaza is a legitimate target.
Yeah, he said they could have risen up against them.
Right. They didn't rise up against them. They voted for them. Therefore, they're a legitimate target. So, by the principle of the laws of war, they have simply erased the fundamental principle. There are other principles, the principle of discrimination, which I'll get to in a moment, but the principle of distinction, they have rejected it, repudiated it. So, you can't make the claim, as your correspondent made, that there's a distinction between Israel's, the casualties in Israel which result from war versus what Hamas did on October 7th. Israel itself has rejected that distinction. It is, I'll get into a moment, but it has declared every human being in Gaza, including those 1,100,000 children, legitimate targets. Number two, the second principle of the laws of war is called the principle of discrimination. That means you can't indiscriminately fire your weaponry. That, for example, let's say you have a weapon, let's call it poison gas. And poison gas, it can't be controlled. And therefore, you can't target it in such a way that only combatants will be the targets of it. So Israel has clearly, since October 8th, Israel has clearly been firing indiscriminately or bombing indiscriminately or targeting indiscriminately in Gaza. I mean, how can anyone possibly believe that Israel has now dropped more weapons in the first week, it had dropped more tonnage of bombs in 1 week in an area that's shorter than a marathon, and its width is the distance from NYU on West 4th Street to Columbia University on West 116th Street. That's 5 miles. And Israel dropped more tonnage than all the tonnage that was dropped in Afghanistan in any year of the war. How can anyone possibly believe or conceive that they are being discriminate in their bombing? Even Bernie Sanders, who was periodically issuing statements as I think the pressure became more and more intense on him, the first few statements that he issued, he kept saying that Israel had a right to attack Hamas. Even if that were true, I'm not going to get into that argument. He's maintaining, perpetuating the fiction that they're attacking Hamas. They're not attacking Hamas.
Right.
Israel, as was revealed on October 7th, hasn't a clue where Hamas is. How could it possibly be targeting Hamas if Hamas had planned this operation for 2 years? There were at least 2,000 Hamas militants involved, and Israel hadn't a clue. So obviously, they don't know where Hamas is. They have no clue about what Hamas operations or its command, where its command and control centers, as Israel calls it, where its command and control centers are. Israel is quite clearly just indiscriminately carpet bombing Gaza. And finally, lo and behold, today, as my comrade and colleague and friend Jamie Stern Weiner emailed me, Bernie finally wrote today. He said Israel has no right to kill thousands of innocent civilians.
Oh, good for him for saying that. Okay.
Bernie, it took you 3 weeks to notice that? It took you 3 weeks to notice? Didn't Israel on the first day say we're not
Right.
discriminating between civilians and combatants? It never occurred to you, Bernie, that Israel was carpet bombing Gaza? That never occurred to you? So, Israel has therefore repudiated, rejected the second principle of the laws of war, the principle of discrimination. So, contrary, I believe, to what your correspondent wrote, there is no difference whatsoever, none, between what Hamas did on October 7th and what Israel has been doing since October 7th. It's been engaged in the targeted and indiscriminate bombardment of the people of Gaza.
The perceived difference between what Hamas is doing and what Israel is doing, I think, speaks to the strength of atrocity propaganda, where you hear these specific stories that don't ever have to be true. But for instance, with Iraq, it was that Saddam Hussein removed babies from incubators, which we now know isn't true.
That was 1990.
Yeah.
And the story was actually spread by Amnesty International.
Oh.
Yeah, Amnesty International was asleep at the switch, or, as often happens with these human rights organizations, the pressure becomes unbearable on them to toe the party line.
Mm-hmm.
So, whatever the reason was, yes,
Wow.
Amnesty repeated the story about the Iraqi troops stealing the incubators from
Right.
the maternity hospitals in Kuwait.
Or Gaddafi with the Viagra. Gaddafi giving his Viagra to
Right,
the troops.
that one I think was a little bit sillier in the great order of
Maybe, yeah. But
um,
these things really stick in people's brains, and they become emotional about
well,
the
I think it's there is the disinformation obviously, and I'm willing. I certainly would take Amira Haas's words. She's very fastidious with facts. She's very professional. I've had my disagreements with her, but on the factual questions, she's, in my opinion, clearly reliable. Sometimes she draws inferences which I think go beyond the facts, but it's clear she's drawing inferences when it comes to facts. And she said that she can verify that Hamas committed atrocities on October 7th. The magnitude of the atrocities, the degree to which the deaths resulted from Hamas um, Hamas uh, uh, crimes versus it was Israeli fire that caused the deaths of people who were taken hostage or
right.
people who were in the buildings where Hamas controlled. I don't think we know. I happen to be, and I could be proven wrong. Don't. Uh, where I'm speculating, I have an obligation to say I'm speculating. Hamas is compared often nowadays, purposely, to ISIS and other of those kind of nihilistic organizations.
Right.
I don't think personally that's accurate for the following reason. If you follow Hamas is quite close to the Hezbollah. They have real working relations. And the leader of Hezbollah, Saad Nasrallah, he has issued numerous condemnations of what he calls the takfiris, Takfiris, takfiris. And takfiris is the is Arabic term for blasphemers. And he says the tactics of ISIS and kindred groups, those are takfiri tactics, and they're deserving of death. So my inference, which I admit could be wrong, is to the extent that there is a solidarity at the political and ideological level between Hamas and the Hezbollah, I find it improbable that they carried out acts like beheadings of children and rapes. Now, again, I could be wrong, but I found those allegations from day one, I found them improbable.
And we
But
now
there's
know,
no
of course, there's no evidence of the beheaded babies, despite the fact that Joe Biden, among others, said there was.
right. Well, Joe Biden said many things where
Right.
his memory seems to have been faulty, including the fact that he never said he would cut Social Security.
Right.
Um, so, but atrocities, I know I'm going to go with what Amir Haas says. Atrocities clearly, or almost certainly, did occur.
And we also don't know which were committed by Hamas members versus
Yes, we
just
don't
random
know versus
people, but
people who broke through the
yeah.
gates and exacted personal revenge. Those are all questions, but I think personally, even if one um, acknowledges atrocities occurred, I think for us, the challenge is trying to understand them, not to excuse them,
Right.
but
There's
to
a
try to
big difference.
understand them. And I personally, as you know, in trying to understand them, I identify with a tradition, and I wanted to see how those
Right.
who are antecedents of mine in that tradition, how they reacted. And so I looked at what William Lloyd Garrison
Right.
had to say about the Nat Turner Rebellion. I looked at what Karl Marx had to say when the communards in the Paris Commune when they executed hostages. I looked at what CLR James had to say about the insurrectionists in Santo Domingo during what's called, the Haitian
Now called,
Revolution.
right.
And in each case, when you look at it, and I also looked at, or people sent me, um, the accounts of how um, the British abolitionists, how they reacted during the Haitian Revolution. And I would say in every case that I examined, in every case that I examined, each time those uh, commentators, part of the tradition which I identify, each time they acknowledged, they didn't recoil from the fact that atrocities had occurred, but in each time they did not then proceed after acknowledging
Right.
an atrocity had occurred. They did not proceed to then condemn the, as it were, perpetrators of the atrocities. They made a distinction, which was the distinction I made on day one, saying, yes, by a dictionary definition, you cannot dispute that atrocities occurred. And if the numbers are accurate, because we didn't really know what the numbers were at the beginning, you remember it went from 50 on day one to 100 on day two. And then it wasn't until around a week and a half later that it had grown to 1,300. Um, I said, you can't dispute that's a very significant magnitude. But there's a difference between, at least I believe, there's a difference between acknowledging that by a dictionary definition, atrocities occurred, and then the allocating of moral culpability, where I refuse to go to the
Right.
second step and denounce those perpetrators of the acts. Many people said it made no sense. They said to me, if you acknowledge it's an atrocity, so you must be condemning the perpetrator of the atrocity. I said, well, I think sometimes life is more complicated than that. And as I said, I was very relieved to discover that's the approach that CLR James took. That was the approach that Garrison took. An interesting fact I was reading last night, W.E.B. Du Bois's um, biography of John Brown. And Du Bois mentions that Garrison was very condemnatory of John Brown.
Mm.
He was, because Garrison was a pacifist, basically.
Right.
He wanted
But he
to.
wasn't condemnatory of Nat
That's the
Turner,
that's
as
the
you.
interesting point. You see, he understood that John Brown was fair game. He was a responsible political actor,
Who
and
had freedom.
right, and Garrison felt he made the wrong choice. By the way, um, John Brown was very condemnatory of the abolitionists. You know what he used to say about them? I'll quote him: talk, talk,
Right.
talk. And he believed, obviously, he believed in
Action.
action. Du Bois praises both of them. He
Mm.
won't take sides. He sees that Brown is an exalted figure, as are the abolitionists. So he doesn't take sides. But it was striking to me that whereas Garrison thought Brown was fair game, let's say I'll criticize an ultra leftist, or I'll criticize the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. However, I won't criticize it when I hear Palestinians singing it. I get it. I understand it, you know. And now to just return to the point where we began, Israel's leading authority in international law is a fellow named Yoram Dinstein, Dinstein. And he was the president of Tel Aviv University. And he's written the classic works on the laws of war. And now I'm going to quote him um, in one of the classic works. for your listeners and for your correspondent. There is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians and a reckless disregard of the principle of distinction. So, we can agree, assuming the facts are right, that what Hamas did on October 7th was a premeditated attack against civilians. However, Dinston goes on to say there's no difference between that and a reckless disregard of the principle of distinction. That means just
Yeah.
indiscriminately firing, bombing, missiling. Well, if Professor Dinstein is right, then your correspondent is wrong. There is no difference from the point of view of law and, frankly, of morality. There's no difference between what Hamas did on October 7th and what Israel has been doing since October 8th, which any rational person must agree with no margin of error that a perfect description of what Israel has been doing is, quote, a reckless disregard of the principle of distinction, meaning we don't care if they call themselves civilians or they call themselves Hamas,
Yeah.
we're targeting them all.
Yeah.
So I think that's what a rational conclusion would be.